Welcome to the Iconic Podcast with me, Soon Yu, your host. The Iconic Podcast features candid conversations with successful Asian and AAPI leaders who share their personal journeys of challenges and triumphs. The Iconic Podcast is brought to you by the Asian American Foundation, by Gold House, and by the founders of the Asian Alumni Chapter of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and is made possible through the generous support of Stanford Federal Credit Union and Altos Ventures.
A bunch of us were at KCON with this giant K-pop phenomenon, and I just saw like tens of thousands of screaming people, mostly non-Asian and some Asian, and I just couldn't help but pinch myself and say, I never saw an Asian on stage or on screen or in books, the rare exceptions. So we weren't able to dream about being part of mainstream culture. And fortunately, that has really changed big time in the last several years.
Welcome to the Iconic Podcast. I am incredibly privileged today to be speaking to Janet Yang. Now, you guys may recognize Janet because she's actually been a seminal figure, and she's been on TV during one of the most important moments in Hollywood, which is the Oscars. Janet is the founder of the newly founded First Light Story House, which is a collaboration between herself, Dominic Ng, who is the CEO of East West Bank, and also Mickey Lee, who is part of CJENM. They are the biggest retailer and entertainer when it comes to, I think, K-drama and all types of things related to bringing great Asian stories to us. Importantly, Janet is the first Asian American to lead the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences. It's 11,000 members, and Janet is at the head of that. She's actually been able to grow the membership and make it much more international. And she's been the producer of dozens and dozens of films, including Joy Luck Club, The People vs. Larry Flint, and one of my family's favorite, Over the Moon. And recently, The Hollywood Reporter listed her as one of the 50 most powerful women in Hollywood. So we are incredibly privileged to be speaking with you today. And just one other note, when I looked at your history, and I've had last probably 4 or 5 days to look at your background and understand a little bit more, and there is a reason one of our other guests who was on the podcast chose you as the guest they wanted us to go and interview. We usually ask, our guests who they'd like us to follow up and interview. Well, as you guys know, Bing Chen, who probably knows a few hundred people in the industry, I asked him, who should we speak with? And out of the hundreds of people he knew, he said, there's only one person that you should speak with, and that's Janet Yang. And so that was such a powerful endorsement. And I think here's the reason why. You've kind of grown up understanding what it's like to be both other and an outsider, and you've become an incredible, what I call Hollywood insider. And you've used the ability to sort of see both perspectives, obviously to build bridges. But I think more importantly, you've actually broken down and dismantled the walls that sort of separate the outside and in. And I think it's interesting what you've done is you've shifted the center of gravity to be wherever the stories are. And it just happens to be that a lot of those great stories are in Asia and in the Asian American community. And so you've actually laid the groundwork for the explosion of popularity for all these incredible Asian films that we've seen and Asian entertainment. And last, I just want to say this. You've made the Oscars in the last few years hella cool. So thank you, Janet, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful introduction. I don't know if I can take as much credit as you give me for, but yes. And I wanted to just correct you on something. I just finished my 3 one-year terms as president of the Academy, so I am no longer in that position. And
that's right.
It was just announced who the new president was, and I wish her the best, and she's wonderful. So, yes.
Thank you. That's really recent. That's like within the last 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, I've just finished that chapter of my life and embarking on a new phase.
An important phase too. So Janet, I always love to, the whole podcast is focused on the idea of the hero's journey. You're our heroine. And so as with any journey, it starts in the beginning. And let's just start with your roots growing up in Queens. I guess being one of the few Asians in Queens where you grew up, is that right?
Well, Queens had a few more, but when I was pretty young at 5 in kindergarten, we moved to Long Island, and at that point, we moved it to all-white community. It happened to be a Jewish community. My parents heard they had good schools, so you know how Asian parents are about education. So I grew up essentially in an all-white community. We were the only Asian family in our neighborhood. So that definitely helps build a little chip on your shoulder. You know, you feel one feels very self-conscious in that environment, and that's definitely how I felt. And I feel like so much of the work that I'm doing is really to heal the childhood wounds that emanated from that period.
That's true. I think we've all grown up with certain traumas, and I think there's two ways to deal with it. You can let it defeat us, or we can use it as incredible motivation to change the world. And I think that's what you've chosen to do, which is really incredible. And I think you talk about your childhood and growing up and not only being in an all white community, but what you saw on TV. It was
Little.
pretty much all white stories and a lot of blonde people. And you talk about some of your more inspirational and instructional childhood films were around Rogers and Hammerstein. Is that right?
Very much so. I loved musicals. I loved watching films of all kinds. My sister is 6 years older than I am, and she took me to movies that were inappropriate for people my age. But, it's pretty astounding. This past weekend, for instance, a bunch of us were at KCON with this giant K-pop phenomenon. And I just saw like tens of thousands of screaming people, mostly non Asian and some Asian. And I just couldn't help but pinch myself and say, when I was growing up, and I was telling some of the kids that were there, I never saw an Asian on stage or on screen or in books, I mean, that rare, rare, rare exceptions. So we weren't able to dream about being part of mainstream culture. And fortunately, that has really changed big time in the last several years.
That's so true. I have a soon to be 16-year-old. And for him, he takes it for granted that there are, Asian movies, there's K-drama, K-pop, and that is all considered cool. And when we were growing up, not only did we not see anyone that looked like us on anything that was of significance, but we were fairly uncool if I remember back how growing up was like. I think what's interesting is though, you also grew up, I think, and your family grew up pretty much not able to go back to China early on, or at least trying to make the decision, should we go back to China? And if we do, we may not be able to get back to the US. But
Yeah.
at some point, I think it probably coincided with Nixon going to China. It opened up and you guys took advantage of it. Can you talk about that seminal experience going back in high school?
Absolutely. It sounds like you've definitely done your research. Thank you. My parents came over from China to study here. They were graduate students. They met in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the University of Michigan. And they were here for a year or two when suddenly the program under which they came over, which was obviously sponsored by the Nationalists, this is the late 40s, was suddenly discontinued and they were kind of stranded and they didn't know what to do. And they thought, oh, should we go back? Should we stay? They were kind of in a holding pattern. They eventually were able to be here legally because of the Displaced Persons Act. And they just kind of waited to see what was going on in China. It was really unclear. There wasn't a lot of information. In the meantime, they said, well, we've got, where my mother got a job at the United Nations. Then my sister was born. And they still were very tentative about whether to go back or stay. So as they tell it, they were just renting furniture, renting places, living kind of in limbo. My brother was born. Then by the time I came around, it was the politics of China had really heated up, and it just seemed like it wasn't a good idea because of their foreign connection, because my mother again worked the United Nations, and so they decided, "Oh, well, I guess we'll just stay in America," At that point, they had accumulated some other friends. None of their relatives were here, but they had met a number of other Chinese through work, and my father, by the way, had a very, very hard time getting a job, even though he was a trained engineer. And at one time, he was opening up a sandwich shop with some friends, and it failed miserably. So, it was a really tough time. It was a classic immigrant experience. But, eventually, again, mostly grew up in this neighborhood on Long Island, and I really knew they didn't talk much about China. I think it was very heartbreaking for them because they didn't have much contact with their relatives. But suddenly one day in 1972, after Nixon and Kissinger's trip to China, my mother came back from work again at the United Nations and she said, "You're not going to believe this. The Chinese ambassador to the UN gathered all these Chinese citizens and said, 'We want you to have the opportunity to go back and visit your relatives. We promise you'll be safe and we encourage you to do that. And we're sure. It literally brings tears to my eyes just thinking about being separated from family for unwillingly, for over 35 years. And, my parents actually told me when I was growing up, you'll probably, they meant they would probably never be able to go visit China, but they were hoping in my lifetime I would have the opportunity. So suddenly for this door to open was quite dramatic. So off we went, and things were still pretty scary then in people's minds, and we decided to split our families. So my mother and I went to go on our own first, just in case something happened or we got stuck or whatever. The rest of the family is here. And then after we came back, my brother, sister, and father went over. And so still the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And I witnessed a lot of things that a lot of Chinese have not yet. It was, a highly militarized society, a lot of military music blaring, and people wearing the same clothes, and very, very poor, and very out of touch with the rest of the world. And they marveled over like my toiletries and whatnot. But despite the unfamiliarity of that kind of situation in society, I was really drawn to the country because meeting my relatives and understanding how my parents grew up, we had so many conversations with about their childhood. I didn't speak Chinese at the time. I only learned later. But so I picked up things, and there was something that was extremely fascinating, intriguing, about that first trip in 1972 that really got my wheels turning. And I thought to myself, I have to learn Chinese. I have to go back and try to understand this country because I almost grew up there. I mean, we were very close to going back, and my parents apparently had many disagreements about this. My mother really missed her family. She really wanted to go back. My father was more practical, said, no, it's not a good idea. So it was kind of an ongoing conversation. But again, until that one trip, it was all a mystery of what was actually happening in China. And then, that trip really, I remember it like it was yesterday. It changed everything. So later on in college, I studied Chinese. And then after college, I decided to go live in Beijing. I was offered a job working at the Foreign Languages Press. And that's when everything changed for me about how I felt like, oh, I touched on the world of entertainment while there, and it just ballooned into what I am now.
Wow. I just want to pause for listeners to understand what you just shared. One was so deeply personal, and yet it's such a shared experience with so many of us in the sense that this idea that, back then there wasn't social media, there wasn't mobile phones, there wasn't, in fact, you couldn't even make calls. International calls were very difficult to do. And so this idea of separation from family for over 3 decades, and in the process, living an immigrant's life, feeling partly because of the way society was, but partly because it felt temporal, a perpetual foreigner. Really understanding the idea of being a perpetual foreigner is incredible. And then I think I think you talk about growing up, you had incredible curiosity and a love for discovery, but also the need to want to connect and belong back to your roots. All those sort of were brought together when your visit to China. And then I think you mentioned this, and it's really important. You also, for the first time, actually saw movies and TV shows where the faces were quite different. They weren't white, they weren't
Right.
blonde, they were Asian. And I think those became such seminal reasons for you to study Chinese at Brown. And then I find it really incredible that you actually at such a young age, decided to leave the States and actually work at the foreign language press in Beijing to be a translator. And it really speaks to what you did all your life, which is this idea of bridging East and West. Both the idea of being a translator, the idea of being raised here and feeling kind of not fully embraced. And I mean, it's just so many themes that I think, I was just thinking about the Joy Luck Club. A lot of those stories that you just shared, they are analogous to a lot of the characters and the experiences that they had. So, how profound, okay?
I
Totally profound that these stories that you lived are ones that are authentically being now shared, in Hollywood and on TV. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that that trip in '72, I didn't see many movies. There were very few as the Cultural Revolution, so there was a very sparse number of any kind of cultural entertainment. I did see some stage plays. They were called revolutionary model operas, and I saw a couple of them, White-Haired Girl and the Red Detachment of Women. It wasn't until I went to live there in the early '80s when that period was over and there was kind of a flourishing of artistic expression in books, in movies, in television shows, and that's when I saw real artistry there. Cultural Revolution was quite interesting for different reasons, but it was that trip that, or not the trip, but the period after college when I went to live there for about a year and a half, where so many things were blossoming, and it really just blew my mind to see this outpouring of creativity there. And I really just, I had never experienced that. I really didn't know many creators, creative types in America, that were Asian. So suddenly to be talking to writers and painters and musicians and filmmakers and cinematographers, it was interesting that that's where I got to have my first really feeling of kind of a creative collaboration and community.
Yeah, I think what's so powerful about that is you marry your sense of curiosity and love of discovery with your desire to connect back to your roots, and you marry it with the timing of world events. I mean, that part was probably out of your control, right? But the idea that Nixon went there, the idea that you then later, after college, went and worked at the foreign language press and just was immersed and saw this sort of this renaissance happening, right? And that you were actually part of that, and I think then that led you to actually, I think later, distribute films in the US, Chinese films. And likewise, I think you worked, I believe, with, I want to say is either Universal or Paramount, and actually brought their stories of America to China. You did both. What an incredible, I think, a marriage of what you like to do with what you were experiencing. How did that come together? And then, you became known for that. That was your expertise, which eventually led to the Empire of the Sun. Can you talk about that?
I certainly can. So I did this, stint in Beijing, and I almost considered living there longer. It was so fascinating to me. I mean, it was challenging on some levels, just kind of day-to-day living, but I decided to come back because I actually helped some people come out of China. I felt like I needed to kind of shepherd them, into society here. But then I wasn't quite sure, what am I going to do with this experience? It doesn't fit into any box. So I decided to go to business school, which was, something that pleased my parents a lot, and I don't regret it. But I'm not even sure if I deserve to graduate. But so I did that for 2 years at Columbia, and then while I was going to school there, I still had Chinese cinema in my mind. So I used to organize these Chinese film screenings and these like mini festivals. And the way to get Chinese films at the time was to pick up these heavy 35 millimeter prints from the Chinese consulate, which was on 42nd Street and 12th Avenue in New York. And there's this like heavy canisters of film. I would pick them up. They allowed you to borrow them. They were so happy that somebody wanted to screen that. I'd find screening rooms. I'd carry these heavy canisters and walk the long blocks on 42nd Street to the subway stop from 12th Avenue to 7th Avenue or whatever. And, I'd had these screenings, and I found there were some people who were really interested because it was so new, it was so novel. Like, wow, movies made in China. They didn't know there was such a thing. And while I was doing that, was introduced to some people in San Francisco who said, "Oh," because sometimes I'd want to borrow a film and it turns out they had it. I was like, "Oh, there's these other people on this planet that are interested in Chinese films." And it turns out they had a theater. They owned a theater in sort of the cross section of Chinatown, Little Italy, right on Broadway in Stockton. And they said, "We're refurbishing the theater and we actually really want to show Chinese films." I'm like, "That's incredible." Long story short, they hired me to run that company, which we called World Entertainment. And so, right after business school, I moved up to San Francisco. It was literally the only job that I could imagine wanting to have. Like all of my classmates are going to McKinsey and, you know, Goldman Sachs, and I was like, no, not for me. So I ended up getting this one job that for me was perfect, and I was now bringing Chinese delegations over from China. There was a very famous actress named Bai Yang who was in this movie called Spring River Flows East, 一江春水向东流, if people know Chinese. Anyway, and that was our premiere. And then, we started showing Chinese films. I was like flying back and forth to China, picking what I consider to be the best films of that era. And it was the birth of the fifth generation of filmmakers. And there's one film in particular that got so much recognition. It was called Yellow Earth by Chen Kaige. And it was, Chinese films were starting to be accepted into film festivals. That was part of my job, is to promote these films and get them recognition and have reviewers review them. So it was, a thing. It became sort of a thing. And we had the theater, and we had a loose chain of Chinese theaters around North America. And I was just so very happy doing that. I felt like I was actually introducing Chinese culture overall and Chinese society, and not just cinema. And then I was contacted by an executive at Universal who read about me. He happened to actually be moving from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and he read about me in the San Francisco Chronicle after our opening. And he had a vision that very few people really bought into at the time, but he saw that China could be a big market. I don't know how he saw it when so few others did, but he essentially hired me to come to Los Angeles and start working with that studio, Universal, and the other studios that they shared a consortium of films for international distribution. So it was Universal, Paramount, MGM UA. So I essentially was representing those studios and now flying back and forth to China to introduce American movies to China. And that was a whole other interesting experience, because we knew the Chinese audiences would not likely be ready for a Star Wars or a Back to the Future or a lot of the movies that were coming out at the time. So we were really digging into the older films in the library. And the first film we brought over, one of the first ones, which is apparently still quite popular in China's Roman Holiday. And I was able to bring
Oh, yeah. Great movie. Great.
and Gregory Peck came over for a retrospective of his works. So that was fun. And then, movies we had, the other ones were Love Story and In the Heat of the Night and Spartacus. So all relatively old movies, like nothing past 1970, I think it was. And then later, obviously the doors started opening, and there have been periods where American movies have made, tons of money in China. So that movie market obviously exploded. It's been a bit of a seesaw of, roller coaster ride in terms of when movies play very well there and when they don't. But it was great to be there at the beginning for the pioneering efforts.
I'm excited to announce that we have a new partner, the Stanford Federal Credit Union. On the show, we talk about the hero's journey, and for nearly a decade, I have trusted the Stanford Federal Credit Union on my journey because they're not like a regular bank. They're a nonprofit that puts their members first by giving back all their profits in the form of cash rewards, amazing rates, and waived fees. To celebrate our partnership, they are offering up to a $620 bonus just for joining. And they are also offering credit cards that earn up to 5% cash back with no annual fees. So please visit sfcu.org/aconic to learn more.
he did this really funny monologue in the beginning, but then, a little bit into the show, he said, "And now I'm going to introduce you to the accountants from PricewaterhouseCoopers." And out came three young children carrying giant briefcases. And those of us who are sensitive to Asians being called nerds were like, gasp, like, why is he making fun of us? Like, he's supposed to be on our side. And then later in the show, the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen came out and said, "Oh, and about the little yellow people with tiny dongs, the minions." So in one show, there were two really, really offensive, what I and those many of us thought were pretty offensive jokes against Asians at a moment when we were thinking that it would be more inclusive.
I think you've talked about your career path being one of zero planning. But when I look at it, I would say it's one of agency, meaning that you definitely took advantage of whatever situation there was and was very resourceful. And I think this underlying curiosity and discovery was probably central to all of it and allowed you to bring others into the fold and really help others who had probably the same sense of curiosity and discovery
Mhm.
about China and obviously the Chinese that were interested in what was going on in America, and bridging that curiosity to then break down those walls that we talked about earlier. Can you talk about how the Empire of the Sun happened? Because
Yeah.
I believe at the time is one of the biggest productions in China ever.
I look back on that period, which is the 80s, with great fondness. China was at a particular place where there was so much curiosity. They were again coming out of the Cultural Revolution period. They had a lot of curiosity about the outside world. There was a lot of optimism, and it was a wonderful time to be there. And there was still a kind of purity, if I dare say it. People do, even Chinese are somewhat nostalgic about that period in the 80s. And they were open to a lot of outside influences. So being able to bring a director like Steven Spielberg to China at the time, and it was like roll out the red carpet, and they pulled out, so many favors, and we did have to. The reason that that timing was great was for various reasons. One was it was still quite centralized. That society was still very much sort of top down, so if we just got to the top and got permission to shoot this movie, which essentially involved closing down the city of Shanghai for quite a few days, um,
Wow.
it was yeah, we really, because we shot right on location. The whole reason to be in Shanghai at the time was that we could recreate 30s, 40s Shanghai in the 80s because it hadn't changed that much. Imagine trying to do it today. It would be nearly impossible. So the timing was good in that the city had not changed that much since the period that we were shooting in. And we got permissions, and that was part of my job for the first quite a few months of is just getting permissions, working its way up the ladder. And people were so lovely. And they did have, because of the emergence of this new generation of filmmakers, as I mentioned, fifth generation filmmakers, there were decent crews. I remember very early on, the Western production designer went to China and he met the crew there and he's like, they've got it handled. Like they know more than I do about how the sets should look, how the costumes should look, how the props should look than I do. So he just left it to the Chinese crew and he went off to England and Spain to work on those sections of the movie. So yeah, it was quite an experience. And obviously they're very, very proud. It was a really big deal for the Shanghai Film Studio at the time to be able to host, everything was done through work units and through Chinese partners. So the Shanghai Film Studio and the co-production corporation were very much involved. And in the meantime, simultaneous to all this happening in Beijing, Bernardo Bertolucci was shooting the Last Emperor movie. And he essentially got permission, which would be also difficult today, to shoot in the Forbidden City. So we were able to shoot right on the Bund. We had almost 10,000 extras. Back then, there were no there was no CGI, computer graphics, to paint them then. So we had to. It was definitely a pretty big operation to organize all the people, get them fed and clothed, and get them to understand what was happening. And I think many people were told not to go to work while we were shooting there because we shut down a lot of roads. They gave us special cars and permissions to get through traffic and whatever. It was an incredible experience, and so in that mid '80s period, suddenly you had two hugely accomplished international directors in Steven Spielberg and Bernardo Bertolucci saying wonderful things about China. And it got so many people excited about exploring the country and shooting in two iconic locations, on the Bund in Shanghai and in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And that was a wonderful period. So in that period, I thought, oh well, I'll just spend the rest of my life doing this Hollywood China thing. But of course, history had a different set of plans for me because in 1989, China became a kind of persona non grata in many people's minds.
Thank you for sharing so much detail. I didn't get that in my research, and that rich detail is so it is so meaningful. I love the idea that you shut down Shanghai or you closed all the shops, closed all the streets.
Very tough
Basically
to
had
do very tough to do today because you
10,000
did it
extras.
like back then because most things are state owned. It's like, "Oh, yeah, this is what we're doing. We're gonna close off this section of Shanghai for you."
Even with the low prices, the catering bill for 10,000 people every single meal just seemed like huge. Anyway, incredible story. That's you were able then to continue this idea of producing films, but somehow you were able to then, I think, partner with Oliver Stone. How did that actually
Yeah,
happen? I mean, you worked with Steven Spielberg's
yeah,
Amblin Group for
yeah,
quite a while, then all
yeah,
of a sudden the Oliver Stone.
yeah.
How did that happen?
After that amazing experience, shooting in China, where I got to spend such quality time with Steven and his producers, Kathy Kennedy and Frank Marshall, I consider them all to be mentors and just so grateful. I will never stop thanking them for that opportunity because it really was the moment where the light bulb went off in my head. It's like, oh, now I know what I want to do. I was like, oh, being a producer and having a say in what people see on screen and the stories and that are told, oh, I got hooked and I had such a great role model in Kathy Kennedy. So after that experience, they asked me to be an executive working at Universal before I was in this little division with my then boss, Skip Paul, who ran MCA Enterprises. Universal was owned at the time by a company called MCA. And now they transferred me to the production division. And so for a couple of years, I was a production executive. And it was very different for me to be in that role. It was a lot of meetings. And I loved being on set. I'm a little restless as a person. And so sitting in meetings and basically saying no 95% of the time to all the submissions that we're getting and scripts and tearing them apart and saying what's wrong and this and that. I don't know. It didn't excite me as much as actually being in production and working, having a little more control over what I was doing. So the opportunity arose to join Oliver Stone. He is someone that I got to know while I was showing these Chinese films earlier on. We became friendly. He was not that famous at the time, but after a couple of his, he had made, by then Platoon and Wall Street and Born on the 4th of July, and he was starting his own company. And when I heard that, I literally said, Oliver, you hire me. So he did.
That's great. That's wonderful.
I literally just, I blurted it out. I didn't even, I didn't have the courtesy.
Unadulterated, right? It was totally
And
well, it was very authentic at least.
was authentic. Shockingly, he did. And yeah, so we started this company and it was a very conscientious decision on my part because of the events of 1989, June 4th. I was like, oh, I can't put all my eggs in the China basket. That's not going to fly. So I have to expand and I should really learn how to be a producer in Hollywood that, produces many kinds of things. So I started this company with Oliver. We had a really great run. I just saw him recently, and we got to reminisce about a lot of things. So it's 7 years, and he was also just a great gift to me in terms of watching a filmmaker who was so dedicated to truth seeking and authenticity and breaking the mold. And, so many of the films he made at the time were groundbreaking. And I saw how it was possible to maintain an independent spirit within the pressures of the Hollywood system, and he was a great example of that. And again, I'm forever grateful. I've been so lucky. I've had great mentors. So we had that period, and then I went and I formed a company with a woman named Lisa Henson. After that, we got to know each other very well on the movie People versus Larry Flint. She was the head of production at Columbia at the time. And we decided to form a company. She was stepping down from that role. So we decided to form a company under the Columbia label.
I actually want to go back a little.
Okay.
And, in some ways, I guess, Tiananmen, what happened there and the consequent yeah, again, another world event that you couldn't control.
Exactly.
But then but in some ways, I'm grateful from it in terms of how it impacted, the movie industry because you actually then got to work on a very independent, film
Yeah.
called Joy Luck Club.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think the other seminal movie was probably 1961, Flower Drum
Um,
Song maybe, and then
yeah.
30 years later was Joy Luck Club. That's how long it probably took. Talk about that because
Yeah.
green lighting something that had an all Asian female
Yeah.
cast with themes of immigrant stories and I mean assimilation, generational issues, identity issue, a lot of I would call pre-Me Too issues, right? Um, to be able to make that mainstream, that was pretty bold, Janet.
It was. I didn't know any better. So how that came about was when I was working with Amblin, Kathy Kennedy took me to New York to meet with a bunch of publishers because, then and still today, we're always looking for great books that can be adapted into film. So we were in New York. We were having a meeting with a particular publisher, Putnam, as I recall, and they're going on and on about some of their upcoming titles, and they're mostly talking to Kathy, and then they suddenly, like, whipped their head around and started talking to me, and they said, "Oh, and we just acquired this first-time novelist's book, and we paid more than we ever have for a first-time novelist, but we don't even have the whole book. We only have 3 discrete chapters, and they're not even connected. We just, like, have profiles of these 3 different characters." I was like, "Okay." They said, "But you might really enjoy this," and they gave me the manuscript pages, they were just, like, typewritten pages. And, I took them on the plane with me, and I was like, "Oh my god," and I started crying. I was like, "This is so incredible. I've never read anything that was so close to my life." There had been some other Chinese American authors at the time. Maxine Hunks Hingston had written a book called Woman Warrior, I think, and there'd been a few things here and there, but so few, but this was so close to my personal experience. And it was almost frightening because it was a part of my life that had been kind of invisible and a little not public. Like when you don't have books and movies and television shows that reveal your home life, your private life, your inner life, it's a little scary at first. You're like, wait, these are all things that I thought were not supposed to be exposed. But I read it, the pages. I told the publisher I just loved them, and they said, "Well, get in touch with Amy Tan." I'm like, okay. And so on my next trip to San Francisco, I got in touch with. We sat and chatted about this. I said, I'm like, I know nothing yet. I'm just starting out in the business, but I will do everything I can to get this made because this to me is so powerful. And she started sending me chapters as she was writing them. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And somehow years later, after the book was published, after it had become a best-selling novel for so many weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, we were able to basically sell it. Most people, we took it around to all the studios. Everybody said no. Most of them said things like, "Oh, can you put more white people in it?" And fortunately, Amy at that time had made an arrangement with Wayne Wang, the director, and her co-writer, Ron Bass. And, we all decided that we were not going to compromise the integrity of the novel, that it wasn't worth it. And I told Amy, I was like, you have to be involved in the writing because it's your voice. Somehow the way you tell stories is so powerful and poignant. So that's what happened. Then they ended up writing the script on what we call on spec, meaning without getting paid. So they had ownership of it, and we took it around. And fortunately, Jeffrey Katzenberg at Disney said yes, but he was the only one. There was not like there was a bidding war or anything. And then the movie, was made.
Thank God, thank God. I mean, and thank God for Jeffrey, and that's probably the reason why he became chairman of Disney, right? I mean, because he was able to, see the vision that you guys stuck with, which is truly incredible, and I just think, like you were saying, when I was reading about you, looking at I said, "Oh my god, there's so many parallels to your history, your life with some of the characters, whether it be June or" and actually, it's so funny. I'm a man, but I totally related to
That's
was
good.
it the Waverly, right? So like nothing I ever did was good enough. So
Did you cry?
it was
Did
there's
you
just
cry?
so
A lot of men told me they cried. I'm like,
oh yeah, absolutely. First scene, the first I think there's 16 vignettes because it sort of mimics the idea of the 16 pieces of mahjong, right? And the first one where I think she abandoned the kids, I was crying. So yes, and then of course the last scene. What? Of course, yes.
good. No, I'm glad. No, it's one of those films you never know when you go into making a film or anything for that matter. You're just like, is this going to stand the test of time? Will people care about this in a year from now, 5 years from now? But somehow, this movie, which came out over 30 years ago, is still being discussed, and that's gratifying. And it has helped heal a lot of family relations, apparently, and I think according to the feedback I've gotten, so many Asian filmmakers were inspired and emboldened by that film to be able to go into the industry. They're like, oh, this is possible because they had the same journey I did. It's like, I don't see anything. I don't know if we can do this. So I'm really happy about that, and I feel
It's
like I'm
truly
one of
iconic
those
from,
girls. Yeah.
film history, but from a personal level, you're right, it heals a lot of because it gives both perspectives for a set of behaviors which, on the surface, you would think, "Oh, there's antagonism, there's conflict," and yet when you understand both perspectives, there's this shared love, and you needed both to and you could fully understand why both were acting a certain way. So it was truly, truly groundbreaking, and thank you for doing that. On the Iconic podcast, we really celebrate the idea of the hero's journey. And fortunately for us, one of our partner organizations is at the forefront of celebrating our great heroes and their stories. And that organization we work with is Gold House. Gold House is a cultural ecosystem that unites, invests, and champions Asian Pacific leaders to power tomorrow for all of us. To learn more, please visit goldhouse.org. I know we don't have a lot of time. I do want to talk
Yeah.
about your work at the Academy really quick, and then maybe sort of
Yes.
segue into, the
Sure.
future. But,
Yeah.
something happened, in I think it was I wanna say it's 2016, yes, during the Oscars, where Chris Rock brought in a bunch of can you describe what happened and how
I
that spawned you
well,
to take action?
I can totally describe, and again, this is another example of where history has been kind to me because weirdly, after China was really shut down for a long time, I was producing a lot of things here in Hollywood. Then it started opening up again around the time of the Olympics, even years prior, 2008, and it was a flourishing of again a lot of people going back and forth and deals being made and investments and a sharing of creative voices. And I ended up making 2 or 3 films in China at the time. I was like, "Oh, I'm back in China. I can do this again. Everything's opening up." It seemed at the time this was the path forward, and then and then it wasn't again. So, yeah, I'm used to that heartbreak by now. But in 2016 at the Oscars, there was a lot of excitement initially. There was awareness that the Academy membership had been mostly white, mostly male, and mostly old. And the statistics came out. And the CEO at the time, Dawn Hudson, very much was trying to change this. And she hired an African American host in Chris Rock. And we were like, we're so excited. He's, because he was all about the meme of Oscars So White came out that year, and there was so much discussion about it. And then, so we were watching with great anticipation. He did this really funny monologue in the beginning, but then, a little bit into the show, he said, "And now I'm going to introduce you to the accountants from PricewaterhouseCoopers." And out came three young children carrying giant briefcases. And those of us who are sensitive to Asians being called nerds were like, gasp, like, why is he making fun of us? Like, he's supposed to be on our side. And then later in the show, the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen came out and said, "Oh, and about the little yellow people with tiny dongs, the minions." So in one show, there were two really, really offensive, what I and those many of us thought were pretty offensive jokes against Asians at a moment when we were thinking that it would be more inclusive, right? So just very spontaneously, I had been a member of the Academy for quite a few years, had never done anything but gotten my DVDs and voted. Like, I didn't know anything about the leadership, the Constitution, the anything. But that was such a wake up call. Like, oh my God, what is going on? We're so not included in what's considered not white. I mean, like, what happened? So I was going to write an editorial, and then somebody called me and said, "Oh, we're going to do a group letter." I was like, "Oh, that's great. That's a great idea." We didn't even, I personally, and many of us didn't know who else in the academy was of Asian descent. There was no information about that, but we just started calling everyone we knew who might be. And we're like, "Are you a member? Are you a member?" And then, "Do you know other people who are members?" And we managed to collect, quite a few signatures. I think over 75 that we found out there were like at least 100 members, which right now doesn't even seem like a big number, but is a lot more than I thought because I never saw Asians at any event. Like, I just wouldn't know. And then a bunch of us signed this letter. We sent the letter in, and I think somebody leaked it. It went viral. Ended up, and this is the birth of social media too, which was also great timing. And there was a lot of discussion on social media, like, wow, it is weird. Why did they do this? And then we got a lukewarm response back, and then, but it was not strong enough. And I was like, well, I knew the CEO at the time. I was like, let's write her and demand a meeting. So we did that. And she said something quite interesting because she said, bring as many people as you want. And I thought that was very brave of her because a, a bunch of us, 12, 15 of us went in, and there was, George Takei and Sandra Oh and, other people like Ang Lee signed the letter. It's like we showed that we were a force, even though we weren't seen as that as such yet. And from that meeting on, they basically said, "Oh, you should sit on this inclusion committee." So that was the beginning of that. I think it also gave birth. I think that event, basically, which again was going viral, was pretty. It became an impetus, I think, for the founding of Gold House. Because shortly thereafter, Bing Chen contacted me, said we should do something. There's a bunch of us in Silicon Valley, where he had worked at YouTube, Google, I said, okay, I can round up all the people that I now know, who are both Academy members. So we were starting a kind of grassroots movement. We had a reception. We were like, let's do more. And we were feeling like, oh, there's so much we could do, but we didn't think at the time it could be anything official at the Academy. So we're just doing it again privately. And then also around that time, Gold House in 2017, Bing and I, got together with a few other people and said, let's create this thing. And that has just exploded. So much happened in that period. And then the good news was that Gold House decided that one of its first missions should be really to amplify the films that are coming out that were made by and for Asian, Asian creators and with a strong Asian cast. And so we got very lucky that in 2018, Crazy Rich Asians came out. And it was often touted as being the first movie backed by a studio with an all Asian cast since the Joy Luck Club. And that's exactly 25 years in between. So that was, and a lot has changed since that time. Bless John Chu. for for making that movie and really moving the lead. I think people remember the Joy Luck Club for having broken some ground, but it didn't really change the landscape in Hollywood very much. Crazy Rich Asians absolutely did, and now we're just seeing, I think, an unstoppable force from our community of films and television shows.
Absolutely. I just wanna acknowledge you and the founders of Gold House, Bing and John, and so many of you guys that have come together from that 2016 event. Since then, I mean, not only has there been the gold open of all these great movies such as Crazy Rich Asian, I mean, you have all these award-winning, movies with award-winning
Yes.
actors like, Awkwafina for The Farewell, Parasite,
Yes, Paris,
Minari,
Minari,
of course, you can't
beautiful.
forget Everything Everywhere, right? I mean, what
No,
a
it's just amazing.
groundswell
And
of
then in
talent.
television, you got Shinobi, Shinobi, Shogun and Beef. I mean, just like everywhere, it's, and in the publishing world. So it is really and then K-pop, you know. So it's been sometimes I wake up and I just pinch myself. I'm like, whoa, I'm living to see this happen. It would have been if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, no, come on. No way, no way. So, yeah, it's been very gratifying.
You're being very humble because when I looked at what's happened in the last, let's say, 7 years, a lot of the groundwork was laid by you in terms of having us understand the idea of Asians in media, and then having obviously call it American stories in China, and then the marriage of both, and how it seeped in, to Korea and to China and to other places and into Hollywood and into being Asian American. All that was laid out basically by some of your early platform work.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much,
Well,
Jan. And obviously you stepping in and then really sort of taking all this energy and directing it in the last few years, and showcasing it as I mean, I've never seen so many Asian faces on TV during the Oscars as I've seen in the last few years. I think you were sitting with Joan Chen and you guys, I mean, you guys look so cool, like, everyone wanted to be you. So, I mean, thank you for making not only the stories relevant and authentic and unique and mainstream, but really for making it so cool.
oh, thank you. And yeah, we that's why those jokes at the 2016 Oscar was so hurtful. It was like they again perpetuated the stereotype of us being nerds and also for the men to be emasculated. I was like, no, those are the two things that I think are the most sensitive in our community that we've been fighting. We've been trying to valiantly overturn those stereotypes. And they just went in and cemented it. So anyway, but it spurred a lot of other great activity and, community building and consensus building, and I'm just so proud of our community, honestly. It's, um it's a team effort, and one thing that I always come away with is people are so kind. Like, I have rarely met a jerk in the work that we've been doing. There's something about the Asian culture and philosophy about thinking about group, humility. And I just think it serves us so well, especially in this day and age where a lot of forces are going in the other direction. This idea that we are take care of each other, we care about family, we care about us as a community. And I think that is our strength, really.
There's so many more themes I wanted to talk to you about. I know you teach at LMU. There's advice you would give to young filmmakers, especially Asian ones. And
Yes,
I know you're starting this new venture, which I
yes.
believe because it's so new, you really can't
Yes,
talk too much about it.
that's much.
So here's the thing. I would love maybe a year from now to bring you back on and we could talk about all these
All
things.
right, that sounds good.
Yeah, but your statement about our community is so right. I have one final question. It's when you look at our community, are there one or two folks that we should also be sharing their story because their story would be meaningful for our community to understand, to inspire them to do even more and bigger and more audacious, bold things? Are there a couple folks that I think the community would really benefit from hearing from that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, it's the people that first come to mind are the obvious ones. John Chu is a hero amongst us. S-
Major hero.
So is Destin Daniel Cretton, who did
Okay.
Shang-Chi and did all these beautiful films. I mean, there. I wish I could find somebody that's not so obvious. I mean, the Stephen Yun's, the Awkwafina's, Jimmy O Yang because he's a
Mhm.
comedian, Jimmy and Ronnie Chang.
Ronnie, yes.
Ronnie, and there's so many people that are really, breaking down barriers in that sense. It's been really interesting because this new movie, Noja 2, which is the highest grossing animated movie from ever, and it comes from China, it's such a rare occurrence, right? That there's a movie from China that people want to see, and we're helping with the release of that. But it's really helped me think about how everything serves everything else. I just made a doc about a Korean indie rock band called The Rose. I would say they are amazing. They remind me of the kind of music that I used to love to listen to, where the musicians actively wanted to build community and talk about how we are one. Their new album is called World, and it's like I just went to their concert last night, so it's very fresh in my mind. We are one. We are the world. We are you. I feel like that message has often gotten lost in music. So they're heroes in my mind. They have a huge following, but it's not the K-pop, following. It's their own K-rock thing that's burgeoning. Yeah, those are a few of the names that I can think of. There's amazing authors out there, incredible Asian American authors that are fantastic. So many. Well, I can give you maybe another list. I don't have one person like Bing did. I have like so many people come to mind.
Well, being the glue and being the sort of, I think, gravity that you've created in terms of storytelling, you're running into so much of our creativity and so much of the talent, and you've been mentors to so many of them. So, thank you. I know your personal mission is to have goodness win, and everything you've said and you've talked about, you've done that, and I wanna thank you from the bottom of my heart
Thank you
that,
so much.
you've made this podcast want to be
Oh,
great and good, and so thank you, Janet,
you're
and
so
thank you for your
welcome.
time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. And hello, everyone
Likewise.
else. Take care.
Take care, Janet. Thank
Bye.
you.
See you.
Listen to all episodes of Aconic on aconicpodcast.com. You can also catch new episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.